They will produce in that atmosphere of freedom, and the result will be not only a prosperous society, but a free society, a productive society, and one in which unemployment is very low. That was the message that we got across. And as a result of all that, many of you know the inventions. Radios. We had popularizing refrigerators. And there were people who said, oh yeah, well now the Iceman is out of a job. You know, the old guy who had to haul a big chunk of ice up 3 flights of stairs and put it in your old icebox. That poor guy was unemployed. But we employed so many more building refrigerators that the American economy flourished in an incredible way. California came into it. Talking movies came in 3 years after the big Coolidge tax cut. Well, why not take a chance? If you succeed, most of the revenue you make, you're going to get to keep. We had, you know, it's funny because the movie business, the talking movies in 1927, very important. Another invention that was absolutely critical to the movie industry, you don't often associate this, especially here in California, is air conditioning. Theaters had a lull in the summer because people didn't want to go to a hot theater in the summer. But air conditioning, again, we had the tax cuts came in, and Willis Carrier took a chance and made air conditioners for movie theaters. And the first theater was in New York in 1924, took a chance, and their attendance went way up when they started showing movies with air conditioning. Other theaters chipped in, and you had 300 theaters had air conditioning by the end of the 1920s. And so California benefits indirectly from all of this entrepreneurship. You get a flow out here to California that is very good for the state. Now, you get all of these inventions. It's fascinating because, for example, we had an invention in the 1920s called hookless number 2. Hookless number 2. Anybody speculate what I'm talking about? I think I heard. Not Velcro, you're close though, the zipper. The zipper. It was invented before the 1920s by Gideon Sundback, a Swedish inventor. And when he took it to the patent office, they said, well, I don't know about this, but I'll give you a patent for it, but I can't imagine a use for it. And what happened was in the 1920s, when all of a sudden the taxes go down, entrepreneurship goes up, P.F. Goodrich decides to take a chance, and they invest in the first wide-scale product that a zipper was used on were women's galoshes. And they advertised them in Good Housekeeping in some of the women's magazines, and they had someone up there, I was going to say with a galosh, is that the singular or whatever? But they're up. And it showed the woman was zipping, well, what we would call zipping her galoshes up. And that's where the hookless number 2 went out the window. Madison Avenue got a hold of that. And the caption read, "Zip her up." And zipper became popularized after that. All of this is part of the entrepreneurship of the 1920s. Now, I say this, and I emphasize this for a purpose. When Calvin Coolidge and Warren Harding promoted tax rate cuts and federal spending, people said, oh, well, you know, we can't see what might happen. You're losing revenue. But what they're saying is, number one, you're not going to gain when you switch revenue from the private sector to build roads in the public sector. You're not going to gain jobs. It might be a good thing to build a road, but you're not going to reduce unemployment doing that. You have to create entrepreneurship. Now, if someone would have asked them, what are you going to create? They're going to say, I don't know. Do you see the whole point? I don't know what's going to be created because the entrepreneurs have to build the products and we'll see what people want to buy. He couldn't say, well, if we have a tax cut, we're going to invent the zipper. So zip your lip and get away from it. None of that ever would have happened. The point is you say, I'm not sure what will be invented. But when you turn entrepreneurs loose, I would rather trust them in a free society than trust central planners planning projects with other people's money. You know, it is interesting. The 20s was such a prosperous decade, and we had all of those good things happen. The sad thing was that President Hoover, who came in after Coolidge, kind of let me have split in the Republican Party. And just as we've had splits in the Republican Party today. And Hoover was kind of in the wing who said, he was the one advocating in the early 20s that we have a stimulus package. And when Hoover became president, he immediately wanted to tinker with the economy. And we had, for example, the tariff was raised, and we had the highest tariff in U.S. history. We tinkered with the Federal Reserve. Milton Friedman has written extensively on this in a very good way. And we raised interest rates, so it was harder to borrow money, and that created problems. And then Hoover had this idea, let's raise the income tax back. And he raised the top rate to over 60% on top income. And the United States goes into a Great Depression. Well, actually, it was just the beginning of high unemployment. It was still under our control to do something, and when Franklin Roosevelt came in, he campaigned on a balanced budget. When he got in, however, he began to have a great deal of spending. He accepted the idea of the stimulus package, and you begin to get massive federal spending in U.S. history for the first time. If you look at some of Roosevelt, and Roosevelt thought, well, my gosh, if Coolidge could do well by not investing, he called it investment, right? By not investing anything in the American economy, look what government investment I'm going to do. It should even be better. And of course, it got worse. It's interesting to look at that. The whole idea of the stimulus package, for example. How many have heard of the WPA? A lot of, maybe some of you, how many had parents or grandparents maybe who worked on the WPA? Look, I see quite a few. My father-in-law, Anita's father, worked on the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Many people worked on these projects. Now, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, was mainly building roads. It was doing what Harding was told he should do in the 1920s. But when they were building these roads, it was kind of interesting. We had unemployment not really going down. It was always fluctuating a little bit between 15 and about 20% during Roosevelt's years. Now, here you have a situation where you think, and it puzzled a lot of the people who were with Roosevelt and his so-called New Deal, which was going to give the American people something different. They said, well, my goodness, we're creating millions of jobs. We're putting people to work building roads. Some of these roads were well done. Some were very poorly done. When I had my first teaching job in Kentucky, I was teaching at Murray State, which is in Kentucky, and I was on a street that was built by the WPA. And I thought, well, this doesn't look too bad, you know? And I got one of my old elderly neighbors and said, do you remember the WPA building this street? And he just rolled his eyes and said, you have never seen such a boondoggle in your whole life. By the way, boondoggle was popularized in the 1930s. And a lot of it was with the WPA. And I said, well, what happened? He said, well, first of all, that we couldn't get him to move to build the road. He was pointing down to my house. He said, they were there, and then a month later, they'd be up to my house. You know, they'd go about 20 feet. And I said, well, why? He said, well, because the minute that they were finishing the project, then they wouldn't get paid anymore. So they just kept slowly building the road. And then I said, well, it looks pretty nice to me. And he said, yeah, the city redid it after they were done. So some roads were disasters. I have to say, some of the projects done were better because some people are conscientious workers and made an effort to do a good job. But it was only because they made that conscientious effort. There was very little supervision of the WPA because Roosevelt found that even though it wasn't reducing unemployment, because he'd have 1 million people work on the WPA, but then the tax revenue taken was subtracting jobs in other areas. For example, Roosevelt raised the tax rate to 79% on top incomes. He later raised the tax rate to 94% on all income over $200,000, and then wondered why the Great Depression lingered. We were letting people keep $6,000 out of every $100,000 they made. What's wrong with them? Well, of course, the Great Depression was lingering in the midst of this, but Roosevelt found out something about the WPA, and that is, even if you didn't gain any net jobs, because see, you're putting 1 million people building the roads, but it's taking tax revenue out of the circulation, which they could have bought products. They could have bought washing machines, refrigerators, zippers, air conditioners, something they could have bought, or radios, but they didn't because it was taken from them to build these roads. So you weren't really creating any new employment. But one thing, as I say, Roosevelt discovered that was kind of interesting, and I write about it in New Deal or Raw Deal, was that once you had those people working on the roads, they were there at the voting booth for you. This was the whole point. Roosevelt would say, look, if General Motors is employing, let's say they lay off 10,000 people because of the Great Depression, because we weren't selling cars. We sold 5 million cars in 1929. We sold 1.6 million cars in 1933. You get layoffs at General Motors. Okay, let's say we lay off 10,000. On the average, 5,000 might be Republicans and 5,000 Democrats. But once they're laid off, if we put them on the WPA, they're no longer 5,000 Republicans and 5,000 Democrats. We find that they're 85% Democrat. Now, I'm not suggesting that Roosevelt said, boy, we sure better not get prosperity again. We're going to lose some votes. I don't think his mind quite worked that way. But you can see why he was not disappointed in a situation where all of a sudden he had a lot of new voters on these projects. Now, here's what some of the people who were involved said, and I quote this in my book. V.G. Copeland, the Democratic County Chairman of Indiana, explained his opinion clearly. What I think will help is to change the WPA management from top to bottom. Put men in there who are in favor of using these democratic projects to make votes for the Democratic Party. I'll say at least the guy is honest. So is the WPA director in Jersey City, New Jersey. He's the director of the WPA, and he answered his telephone, Democratic headquarters. And nobody can get a job in the WPA unless you're a registered Democrat, and usually unless you make contributions to the Democratic candidates. Yeah. James Doherty, a New Hampshire Democrat, said, quote, "It is my personal belief that to the victor belongs the spoils, and the Democrats should be holding most of these WPA positions so that we might strengthen our fences for the 1940 elections." Let me just do one more. It's from a congressman, Frank Talbot. He's from New Jersey, from Newark, and he made this statement, quote, he's in Congress, and he's a Democrat. He says this: "In this county, there are 18,000 people on the WPA. With an average of 3 in a family, you have 54,000 potential Democratic votes. Can anyone beat that if it is properly mobilized?" It was hard to beat that. And that's why Roosevelt discovered in 1936 that even though we still had double-digit unemployment, he was able to carry every state in the Union but 2, Maine and Vermont. In the Electoral College, Roosevelt beat his Republican opponent 523 to 8. And Roosevelt learned a lesson. You can go through a depression, a bad one. It could endure in your administration. But if you handle the patronage properly, you can win re-election. And thus, we had a continuation of this kind of strategy. Some of these programs are absolutely wild, like the AAA, right? How many remember the Agricultural Adjustment Act? The AAA, you've heard about that? Yeah. Well, the AAA was another one of these programs. I have to say this about the AAA, and I have to be candid about it. The AAA was designed in such a preposterous way. It could only have been designed by a college professor. It's one of those things, I'm sorry to have to say this, but it was a Harvard professor, Professor Black in the econ department, and here's the logic, And, you know, having taught for decades, I could just